All right, just doing a mic check again. You guys everyone can hear me? Okay, great. All right, so it sounds like everyone had heard the beginning part, which when we did the intention and we did our opening. So I'm not gonna necessarily do that part again. Um, but I just want to welcome all of you to Muslim Women's Alliance's webinar on Coping with Me Too. We're an organization that is here to empower and develop women. So we're happy and honored to have all of you here with us to really work through what many of us have been going through over the last week, but honestly, what many of us have been going through for years, if not our entire life. We wanted to create this space to have this discussion because particularly in this last week, the amount of uncertainty that has been brewed since the administration took over about 1.5 years ago has really come to such high levels of anxiety over just this past week. And so we wanted to create this space so that all of you will have an opportunity to kind of process what this meant for you. Also hear from some amazing experts who I'll introduce in a little bit. And really start this process, this healing process, or this healing journey for all of us. And I personally, for the last 1.5 years, it's been one thing after another that I know many of you faced. Whether it's one particular group or another particular group, at some point we've all had our share of being under attack. And I think with the Supreme Court hearings that happened this week, these last couple of weeks actually, it's really taken it to a whole different level. And I think, you know, if you were like myself, there were points this week because with social media and things being so much more readily available and so much more in your face, and being able to hear and personally hearing Dr. Ford and her testimony on my way to work, there was such anxiety the rest of that day. For some people, we heard from many people that they didn't even understand why there was so much anxiety, right? For some people were triggered by the situation because of terrible things that have happened to them. Some people may not have been triggered, but you were upset. You were confused. You were actually surprised by how upset and how debilitating the last few days have been for you. And the truth is, you're not alone. There are many of us who all felt the same thing, and that is the beauty of the womanhood, of the sisterhood. Because regardless of what faith you are, regardless if you have no faith, regardless of all the other identities that you have, because we all have multiple ones, we have one thing that is common, which is the womanhood. And loud and clear, Republican or Democrat, whatever your nationality is, all of us felt the pain from this week. We all felt the pain of Dr. Ford. We all felt the pain of just dealing with this aftermath of feeling like you're not heard, you're not listened to, and what seems like a spectacle and should be a movie is actually real life. And so what we really wanted to be able to do is to make sure that we can create the space today for all of you and any other future people who are going to listen to this, so that you can help yourself process what's going on, and then hear from people, mental health experts and clinicians who can help you work through some of those various emotions and feelings that you may be feeling. So the goal for today is we're going to start off. Dr. Rukhsana Iqbal, who's here, is going to talk to us about triggering. So how to understand your triggers, knowing when you are having a trigger. How do you handle those triggers? How do you kind of move on from those triggers? Also, you know, she's going to touch a little bit about PTSD. For many people, when you all of a sudden get sparred by emotions that you thought were already maybe resolved or healed, what does that look like? What does PTSD look like, and what can you do with it? As well as how do you help others, right? So if you weren't a person who were triggered, but you know you were upset, but you know there's at least one person in your circle of friends that has been triggered, what can you do to help them? And then we're going to move on to Shannon McRae, who's going to talk a little bit about, okay, how do we take back this control? How do we get some semblance of resolve in our hearts and our minds so that we can keep moving forward. What are some tips on how to manage the anxiety, on how to move forward? So I want to make sure that we have enough time for questions and answers. We had some questions that were also sent to us privately, so I will have those. But all of you on the phone will have an opportunity. And I think if this group is this size, then we can definitely open it up for people to ask their questions and comments directly also. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Rukhsana. Thank you.
Thank you, Saror. Can you hear me okay? Yes, okay. So I wanted to thank Muslim Women's Association for inviting me to talk. I think it's really fantastic that you guys are so responsive. You know, you really have your pulse on the community and you're able to be right there for us when we need it. And so I think what will be helpful is to talk about PTSD and to kind of go over just some general basics about what it is, what does it look like. It can kind of masquerade as so many other types of symptoms, or sometimes it can be confused for other disorders. And then talk just a little bit about what to do if you feel like you might be experiencing this. And then hopefully Shannon can kind of take on from there and talk more about sort of how you help yourself sort of in the moment. So when we talk about PTSD, it stands for post-traumatic stress disorder, and it's been described as a very complex somatic, so sort of physical symptoms, also cognitive symptoms, thoughts that you have, as well as mood changes and changes in behavior that result from psychological trauma. And it's been interesting, this last week, talking with patients in the office, and I can't tell you how many people have been, talking to me about this really over the last couple of years, but especially in the last week. And it's not just women that are young who are sort of re-experiencing trauma. The couple of women that I'm thinking about were in their 60s and 70s who are taken right back to trauma that they had experienced at a very young age in their life. And so for them, they were experiencing some of the common symptoms of PTSD that we think about. So things like flashbacks and nightmares, intrusive thoughts, trying to avoid reminders of that trauma, sleep disturbances, and oftentimes it rises to a very significant level where it's really impacting your ability to maybe hold down a job. It impacts your ability to be in a functional relationship. And so it can really have huge ramifications for a person in terms of how successful they can be in their lives. So, people wonder, you hear a lot about PTSD in different sort of arenas, whether it's the Army vet who's come back, or women that have gone through sexual trauma. And so the lifetime prevalence of PTSD ranges somewhere between 6 to 9% in the United States. And so that's a good number of people that are probably walking around that have PTSD, and you really probably don't know that they have it. You really can't tell from the outside. And sometimes, people will often think about, a lot of people will experience trauma in their lives, whether it's a personal assault or a war or a natural disaster. And there was a survey or a study done in the United States that looked at about 5,600 people who had answered that survey. And 82% of those people were exposed to a severe and potentially traumatic event. And about 8% of those people then went on to be diagnosed with PTSD. So, there's a lot of risk factors that can increase your chances of developing PTSD when you're faced with a very traumatic event. And so some of those risk factors can include things like gender. Women are more likely to develop PTSD, the age at which the trauma occurred, race, lower education, lower socioeconomic status, if you've been separated or divorced or widowed, if you have a previous trauma, personal and family psychiatric history, and poor social support. All of those things can make it harder to experience resilience after a traumatic event. And specifically for women, sexual assault is the most frequent type of trauma that is experienced by women that have PTSD. And there was another study of about 4,000 women in the US, and the lifetime percentage of women who at some point in time in their life had PTSD was 12%. So again, that's a good chunk of women that have experienced significant trauma in their lives and have gone on to have significant difficulties with functioning. And I think, when we sort of think back to this week and a lot of the reactions that are occurring both by men as well as women, sometimes you'll hear people not really take it seriously, not really take PTSD seriously, and sort of be dismissive of women when they are saying that they're experiencing these symptoms. And I think what is really, really important is that it's a brain disorder. There are studies that have used MRI scans that show that there is a decreased volume of the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is the part of your brain that encodes memory. And so there's also changes in something called your amygdala. And your amygdala is the center for emotions, including fear, which is key in PTSD. And so there's actual brain changes with PTSD. And it is not something that women are just making up or being hysterical about. And so, when all of those changes occur, the part of your brain that uses logic, the sort of frontal part of your brain, it goes offline, and that sort of primitive brain takes over, the amygdala, and people can experience sort of emotional flooding. And there's a release of norepinephrine, that stress hormone, and it goes on to release other stress hormones in your body, like cortisol. And that goes to the rest of your body, to your heart, to make it pump harder, to get blood to your legs so you can run from that danger. That's basically sort of what is going on in your brain when you are experiencing a life-threatening trauma. And so when that happens, what can happen subsequently to that is that you then have sort of primed your body so that when you are experiencing something that reminds you of that trauma, a trigger, if you will, you're right back there again. All that automatic neural pathway in your brain just goes, and without you even thinking about it, it's an automatic bodily response, and it can be incredibly overwhelming. And so what you'll see is people will say that they are having flashbacks, and a flashback is when you feel as though you are right back in that time and space when you were experiencing that trauma. And you can also have nightmares, intrusive thoughts even during the day. Oftentimes people will become very emotionally numb, and they will sort of feel this feeling of detachment from other people, even from themselves. Sometimes that can really go to an extreme where people feel very, very disconnected, and they can lose time. Sometimes you can have dissociations, basically what that is, and you can have trouble remembering parts of that period of time. And there can also be other sort of self-destructive behaviors, cutting, suicidal behavior. It's a constellation of symptoms that can occur. And, along with that sort of constellation of symptoms, oftentimes comes things like depression and anxiety, and then sort of maladaptive ways of coping with all of that. So maybe it's substance abuse or dependence. And we oftentimes think of all of the psychiatric comorbidity and illness that goes along with it, but there's also medical comorbidity that goes along with PTSD. So people with PTSD have 2 times the risk for things like chest pain, 3 times the risk of heart failure. There was a study recently over the summer that was done in Sweden that looked at people with PTSD, and they found an increased risk of subsequent autoimmune diseases. So there's this huge mind-body connection that you see very well displayed in PTSD. And so again, it is a real illness, a real disorder. And I think when someone is experiencing this, sometimes people have different ways of reacting. When they're feeling triggered and they're hearing about all of this, sometimes they're quiet, sometimes they will sort of retreat, and they withdraw. And other times they may talk to you about it, as a friend. They may disclose it to you. And if they do, I would say to just simply listen. Having someone to be a witness to what happened can be so powerful in validating their experience. And if you yourself are being triggered and you're sort of in this space where, you don't feel right, you feel like your heart is racing, you're having palpitations, your breathing gets real shallow, your stomach is sort of in knots, I think it's helpful to try to be able to identify that. And so if you can, at times like this, when it can be a high time for being triggered, sort of, do a body scan and kind of look to see, am I experiencing any of these symptoms? And sort of take a minute to acknowledge them and to try to then find ways of being able to help yourself calm and to really engage in some kind of self-care. I think that will oftentimes goes a long way. And so there's so many different ways to do that. Everybody's got something that is important to them. So, whether that's going out for a run or journaling or coloring or listening to music that's peaceful, meditation, yoga, deep breathing, some kind of spiritual practice, prayer, all of those things can be so helpful. And sometimes, when your body is just flooded like that and, your heart's racing and everything's just going, it can be hard to remember all of those things. So sometimes it can be helpful to even keep a list, maybe take a picture of that list, have it on your phone, save it as one of your favorite pictures, have it as the background picture maybe on your phone, something so that way it's readily accessible and you can look at it and you can try to access some of those tools that are helpful. So I know that sometimes even talking about this may be triggering for some of the people that are listening. And if that's happening, don't be afraid to, sort of put us on pause, take a break, come back. That's okay. And if you're finding that you're having an exceptionally hard time sort of functioning at work, at home, with your family, don't be afraid to get help. We can absolutely help if people need referrals to therapists or psychiatrists in the community. So, and so I just wanted to close with a quote by Audre Lorde from A Burst of Light. And she says, "Caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation. And that is an act of political warfare." So don't be afraid to fight for your own self-care.
Thank you, Rukhsana. And I heard you, and I'm not sure everybody knows what a body scan is. So
Mm-hmm.
I wrote it down, but I think this is probably before we move to Shannon. Might be good for you just to kind of define for everyone what is a body scan.
Sure. So basically, when we talk about ways to relax, there's lots of different ways to do it, and you can do something where you basically kind of go from head to toe, and so you can try to sort of sit or stand, usually sitting, in a place that's comfortable, and kind of close your eyes, sort of think um, about your head, and sort of notice if there's any sort of racing thoughts. You can notice if there's tightness in your jaw. Try to take some deep breaths in and out. Sort of just notice, your legs sort of sitting on the chair. Notice your feet on the floor, and all of that. As you notice sort of each part of your body, you kind of can either kind of just notice it, or you can kind of you can even incorporate like a progressive muscle relaxation where you sort of like tense up the muscles in your face and you scrunch it up, and then you relax, and you kind of do that progressively through all of your sort of major body parts, and that can be really helpful for people, just to kind of take a moment to notice sort of, what am I feeling? And there's lots of apps that are available that you can use that can help kind of talk you through and guide you through. So there's a lot of resources even online that can help you do that. And a lot of times too, that can be a great sort of grounding technique. Sometimes we talk about grounding techniques where if people are really sort of feeling out of body almost, you can try to focus on what's going on around you. So, maybe I can feel that my scarf is on my head and it's sort of, tight around my head. I can hear that it's quiet. If I listen really closely, I can hear the ceiling fan kind of whirring very softly. Are there any smells around you? Kind of going through your different senses and sort of focusing on those things. And maybe it's looking at something that's in your visual field. So maybe it's your cup of coffee, and you're looking at it and saying, okay, it's glass. I can feel it. It's cold. It's clear. And that can just help to keep you in the moment as opposed to just being out of that moment.
Okay. Thank you so much for defining that. And I should have started with this, but I do want to give it its due course by just giving you guys a little bit of a background on Rukhsana, and then I'll introduce Shannon more properly as well. So apologies, ladies, for not doing that ahead of time. But Rukhsana is a physician practicing adult psychiatry in Hinsdale and general pediatrics in Hammond, Indiana. She has 14 years of experience. She's board certified in family medicine, psychiatry, and consult-liaison psychiatry. So thank you for that talk, and I'm sure people have questions later. I've already been asked about it, and so we'll get to that at the end. And then Shannon McRae now is a licensed professional counselor, originally from New Jersey, now residing in Chicago. She specializes in women's issues, substance abuse, culturally competent care, trauma counseling, and correctional mental health. So Shannon, thank you very much.
Thank you, Bismillah. Thank you for having me. So I guess a good place to start is to pick up where Dr. Rukhsana left off, is talking about anxiety. And just to kind of, I guess, reinforce what anxiety is, it's a fear response, basically to, it's your body, like mentally and physically responding to a threat or a perceived threat. So for example, I'm a therapist. My job is to talk to people every day. I explain anxiety every day. I explain symptoms of anxiety every day. But yet, okay, so it's something that I'm comfortable with. But yet right now, my heart is racing, my palms are sweaty, right? And so this is a fear response that automatically kicks in my body because I'm thinking about what could possibly happen. My microphone could go out. My son could bust into the room at any moment and disrupt, right? And so that anxiety is a natural response to something that we perceive as a threat, right? And so when we talk about anxiety, I always explain it as it's a normal thing and it's okay. And we want to have some level of anxiety because it's also a protective factor. If we're walking out in the street, late at night, there's a level of anxiety that's going to protect us because we're going to be observant, we're going to be cautious, our senses are going to be up. And so anxiety can be a protective factor. But I think when we allow our anxiety to become debilitating, to affect our quality of life, to affect our functioning, I think that's when anxiety becomes a problem. And as I am a therapist, I specialize mostly in addictions. And I've seen studies across the board, right? So most of the studies I've seen have said that up to 70% of women with substance abuse disorders have some form of sexual trauma, have experienced some form of sexual trauma. Anecdotally, I think it's probably more like 95% of women, right? And so when we talk about sexual trauma and we hear about these things that are happening in Hollywood and politics and everyday, things that we hear maybe from our girlfriends or, our coworkers, sexual harassment, things like that, it can definitely be very triggering and produce this like fight or flight response when maybe we're recalling something that happened to us in the past. Maybe it's just a fear, now we're more hyper vigilant because we never know, are we going to be next? So about 2 years ago, the American Psychological Association actually did a survey, and they found that based on the presidential election, that 52% of Americans reported that their stress was coming from like the election and what was going on with the election. And up to 56% of millennials reported that their reason for stress and anxiety was because of the election. And I mean, I know that I personally experienced that myself, constantly watching the news, constantly, updating my social media feeds. I mean, this is just extremely anxiety producing. And saw something else, we know about PTSD, but I saw something that referenced President Trump's stress disorder, right? And so it's just something that, whether you agree with the politics or not, we can agree this is a time of like great, like vitriol, right? There's vitriol, there's stress, there's just all kinds of like nasty things going on. And the more we inundate ourselves with that, the more stress and anxiety we're going to produce within ourselves. So as a therapist, like some of the typical like anxiety therapies that I do involve cognitive restructuring, right? So cognitive restructuring is like restructuring how we think about things. And so if we like have this like irrational fear of like, I don't know, polka dots, for example, like as a therapist, I'll walk you through like, well, why are you, fearful of polka dots? What did polka dots ever do to you? And, we might do exposure therapy. We might do some like desensitization or like techniques to control the worry. And those are typical therapies that I would use for clients dealing with anxiety. But I think what's tricky about what's happening in our current events now is it's difficult to relate to a client that they should control the worry about what's going on, because in my opinion, we should be worried about what's going on. Like we should have this anxiety response because a lot of what's going on is not good. The predatory behavior, the sexual violence, the abuse of power, the good old boys club, like all of that, that's being exposed at like very high levels in our society. And as a professional, it would be kind of absurd for me to try to get a client to become like desensitized to that. And so it presents some problems and some challenges for me as I try to work with clients about what's going on in the world and how it affects, them as the individual, because this is a very real thing. And the typical therapies have to be tweaked a little bit because I don't want you to become desensitized to, these horrible things. So some of the techniques that I recommend and that I use as my, when I go through anxiety myself, Dr. Rukhsana already spoke about, this kind of body scan. We also maybe call it grounding. And it's really just focusing on like the here and now and it's kind of just taking inventory of like all of your senses, right? So you might try to smell something in the room. You might try to focus on a specific color in the room. Try to pick out all of the green things in the room. Sometimes I make my clients like jump up and down and just take an inventory of like how that feels. Or with younger clients, I might have them like shake the sillies out, right? And it's just a way to get in touch with your body and to focus on the here and now versus like all the noise that may be going on in your head. Another thing, for dealing with anxiety is to just allow yourself, give yourself permission to feel however it is you're feeling, whether it's fear, the hopelessness, disgust, anger, whatever it is, that's okay. As I mentioned earlier, like if you weren't feeling that way based on current events, I would think that is the abnormality, right? So I think it's okay to feel this way. We just don't want these feelings and these thoughts to affect like your daily functioning and to be, to begin to impair your daily activities. But as you're feeling those emotions, I would recommend to pinpoint where exactly they're coming from, right? So sit with those feelings and kind of ask yourself, like, what about these events makes you angry? What about these events scare you? And really, try to derive at an answer so that we can then work through some like coping strategies, right? If the worst thing happens or, something like that. I also recommend just going on like a low media diet. We know low carb diets, like let's go on a low media diet. Like it's okay to deactivate your social media. It's okay to set specific times, when you say, okay, now I'm going to consume media and now I'm not going to. I know, when you're online, your intention may not be to focus on the headlines, right? Like you may go on to shop or you may go on to chat with friends, but if they're posting updates and, everyone's reposting things, like you're going to become inundated with all of that almost in real time. And that's in itself anxiety producing. Mental health days. I mean, if you work or you work from home or you're not employed at all, whatever the case is, you need to take time for yourself, right? So this week alone, like I took 2 mental health days, and we call them sick days, but I mean, I think we should really reframe those and call them mental health days, just because wellness, that's vital. If you find yourself feeling more agitated, in the workplace or more agitated around the children or, your family, if you have girlfriends who can take the kids even for a few hours, if you have the opportunity to stay home from work and just really focus on yourself, do something pleasurable, that helps, right? And I think, a lot of time as women, like we pride ourselves in like being able to kind of power through and just get the job done. I remember one time I went on a job interview and one of the questions they asked was like, how many days did you call off in the last year? And this is while I was like pregnant. And I remember like I had only called off 1 day that entire year. And like I powered through like morning sickness and like all of that. And that's actually not good. Like we have sick days. We should take time to take care of ourselves. Because if something happens to you, depending on where you work, you can easily be replaced, right? And so you need to make sure that you're taking care of yourself. Use those mental health days, sick days, whatever you prefer to call it. And along with that, I would say prioritize sleep. I'm not so good at this myself, but when we don't sleep, it truly affects your entire body. You're sluggish. Even when you do sleep, you're still fatigued. You perhaps become forgetful. Your mind is just foggy. It's not good. So take care of yourself physically, but also prioritize sleep. Exercise. I know one time I read a study that said like exercise for just 30 minutes a day has the same effect as like taking anxiety medications, right? And so that's powerful. Like going out, walking, doing some, type of aerobic activity, and you may not even need, any type of medication to kind of help you manage your symptoms. I know I like my coffee, but limiting caffeine, limiting nicotine, right? Because those are stimulants. And if you're already feeling anxious and, feeling this nervousness and kind of feeling of like being wound up, the caffeine, the nicotine is only going to exacerbate those symptoms. And then, as Dr. Rukhsana, already mentioned, if these kind of like in the moment, everyday type of techniques don't work, definitely like seek professional help. A trained professional can help you identify triggers and teach you effective ways at managing those triggers, so that you do not experience impairment. For many of the clients that I work with, I want to show many of the women that I work with who experience trauma. I use this manual called Seeking Safety. And it has a lot of lessons on like creating meaning, taking back your power, compassion, setting boundaries in relationships, just a lot of like really great lessons and techniques. And so like a trained professional can kind of help you learn these techniques, and then you'll be able to then activate them in your life on your own, when you feel yourself going through some type of anxiety response.
Great. Thank you very much, Shannon, for going through that. I think I liked your low media kind of suggestion, because I know there were points, and I had a good friend of mine who was like, today might be the day for anyone who wants to kind of lay low on social media. FYI, there's all this stuff, there's more things going on, and everyone's sharing their stories, because I think what's really important to recognize is that when we share things that happen to us and we share our stories, there's a power in there, because it can obviously signal to someone else who isn't able to share, that they're not alone, that we're kind of here together, that we have this bond that kind of connects us. But at the same time, when you are hearing all the shared stories, to kind of what Shannon was just saying, that anxiety just keeps building. It's almost like an avalanche that can kind of keep going. And part of the whole purpose of today's session is to be able to recognize in yourself, like Rukhsana was saying about the body scan, recognize when your heart is racing, recognize when you maybe are having some of these symptoms of the anxiety that Shannon was referring to, and being okay with like the number one person is you, that you need to really care for. Many of us are moms. Many of us might have a husband or have jobs, have all sorts of different things that you're responsible for. And it's important to just be able to take that time, for yourself. So I certainly took the low media yesterday, which was obviously hard trying to plan this thing. But, I think that's probably one of the best advices, especially in the age of technology that we're in as well. So I'm going to, we're now going to go into our kind of discussion questions part of the rest of the time now. So this is really meant to be an open dialogue. So many of you guys, if you want to unmute your phones and ask a question, please feel free to do that. If you want to also type your questions in the group chat, that is fine. If you do it privately to me, only I see it. So you can do that, and I can ask the questions. I'm going to start us off. We do have some questions that people had submitted also. And I'm going to start off with one. Just listening to you guys talk, a question that I thought of because I heard from so many people, and I think myself too a little bit. I think this concept of triggering to people who are not in the mental health world, I think a lot of people were very confused with why they felt the way they felt, and not because they think it's wrong. They understood it wasn't because it's wrong. A lot of people just feel like what's going on this past week is wrong. But how do they understand, is triggering a byproduct of PTSD? Is any time you go through some experience that is an unwelcoming experience, how do you understand whether it's PTSD and then that's why you're having triggers because it's this very deep rooted maybe trauma, versus I think unfortunately sometimes what we do to ourselves, and we heard this from some women, is try to categorize the trauma into like small, medium, large, or low, middle, high. And I think for a lot of people, they were confused by why they didn't think that maybe a situation they had earlier was that traumatic, that all of a sudden came flooding, like you were talking about, Rukhsana, with the flashbacks, or all of a sudden thinking about things that you might not have thought about for God knows how long. So how do you kind of balance and understand, what is really, what can cause PTSD, and this kind of concept of what we're maybe pretty defining for ourselves that something is small, like a small trauma.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, usually with PTSD, the level of inability to function sort of has to really rise to a certain threshold to be able to be diagnosed with true PTSD, and you have to have several of those symptoms that we talked about, and for it has to be consistent over a month's time, where you're having flashbacks, nightmares, avoidance of triggers, changes in mood, cognition, detachment, always being on guard, sort of being very hypervigilant. Thank you. Yeah, and scanning for any perceived dangers in the environment, and so and you have to have all of those, and causing significant impairment in different areas of your life for a solid month to really be diagnosed with true PTSD. So I think that's important to keep in mind. And I think, okay, so you've got those people that do have all of that, but then there are so many of us that do feel upset or anxious hearing about all of this. And sometimes it can be because maybe you've experienced some level of harassment or trauma. And so sometimes then, the responses that you're having may be sort of commensurate with that trauma, or sometimes it's above and beyond what that trauma was. So I think it's important to realize if you're continuing to have symptoms, even beyond, let's say, like in 2 weeks from now, the hearings are over or whatever, and you're still having significant problems functioning, then that's when it would be time to really talk to someone who is an expert, and to try to get evaluated. Or if you find yourself coping with those feelings of distress in dangerous ways or unhealthy ways. So if you're, drinking or cutting or smoking or marijuana, all of those types of things to try to cope or numb or de-stress, then that would also be concerning.
Okay. And Shannon, did you have any thoughts on that?
I agree with everything Dr. Rukhsana said. And I would just also add, you don't necessarily have to have experienced a trauma to feel triggered by what's going on, right? So like I wore this shirt, be a good human, right? Like if someone's, if you're watching these hearings and you're listening to this testimony, you should feel triggered. Just my opinion, you should feel triggered. Just as a human, someone explaining, some horrific things that still haunt her to this day, with Dr. Ford's testimony. So I think it's natural and a normal response to feel triggered by some of the things we're hearing.
Okay, great. Thank you. So there's a question that came in from the group. So I'm just going to read it out. I've heard that self-care is not just zoning out in front of Netflix. Are there certain types of self-care that have more impact versus others?
Well, I would say that that's true. I think for some people, and, really depends on where you're at, for some people, if the only thing that you can really access is zoning out and watching Netflix, that might be okay. But, hopefully the goal, I guess, would be to help you try to find more ways of engaging in self-care and trying to find things that might be more healthy. But it's usually a process, so not everyone is just going to go and run a mile, that won't be as accessible for many people. And so you have to kind of start with what you can do and sort of work up to trying to incorporate other ways that might be a little bit more healthy. Because sometimes what can happen then is if you have, binged on Netflix for 5 hours, then at the end of it, okay, you're feeling less triggered, but then you might sort of feel overly guilty for oh my God, then the negative self-talk comes, oh my God, I just wasted 5 hours. What am I going to do? And then you feel overwhelmed and you're looking around and oh my gosh, I've got all this stuff to do. So So that's where you sort of work on kind of trying to find healthier ways of coping.
Yes. And when I talk about self-care, I try to frame it in a way of like, yes, it's nice to, go and get a massage. It's nice to, take that bubble bath. But what I envision self-care to be is like, you don't need, how should I say? Like, you want it to be sustainable. You want it to be something that you don't have to do only. I'm trying to think. So, for example, you want to achieve wellness in like all these different dimensions of your life, like spiritual wellness, physical wellness, emotional wellness, financial wellness, like, all of these things. And so you want to create a life where you don't only have to take a bubble bath to feel like you're taking care of yourself, right? You're getting your finances in order on the daily. You're eating healthy on the daily, right? So you're building a lifestyle to where you don't have to just take that 5 hours to zone out. You're building your daily routine up so that your entire life is self-care, is how I try to look at it.
Yeah, I think that's really important, because I do think there's a lot out there around self-care of things that you have to spend money on too. And I think it's really important to recognize, and I like the way you said it, Shannon, because it's a mindset, caring for yourself, not an event that you do. And some events could help you care for your mind, for sure. But I know if any of you are like me, I tend to be very hard on myself. And I think one of the most things that I've heard both of you actually say this in other settings, around this concept of being kind to yourself. Like, the person who if I was talking to Shannon, would I talk to Shannon the way do I talk to myself? Probably not. I'd probably be hugging her or telling her that she's okay. And we often don't do that to ourselves because we often hold high expectations. And I think as women, there's a lot of studies out there around the amount of multitasking that women do. I thought it was just like, in my head that happens. And then I remember talking to someone from the National Alzheimer's Association, and they were talking about the stress that we put on our brains because of all the multiple things that we do at once, and not just caring for people, but actually just doing things. And so I think keep making sure that self-care is really more of a mindset, that you take those moments to kind of stop, do the scans like Rukhsana was talking about, in terms of understanding like, okay, I'm feeling something right now. Like, yes, I can take 5 minutes out of making dinner, out of working, out of whatever it is that you're doing, to just stop and like recognize that there's stuff happening to your body right now. Like I can feel my heart racing, or my mind is wandering and I don't understand what's going on, but give myself the 5 minutes to actually at least like acknowledge it. Because honestly, you would do that if you saw somebody else. You'd probably ask them, how are you? What's going on? And I think that's really important, because I think we often lose sight of that we're the person that we need to take care of the most. Any other comments before I move on to the next question? Okay. So I'm going to ask one question that was submitted, and then it looks like we just got another one here. Okay, do you call people who have been through trauma victims or survivors? What are your guys' thoughts on that?
I do admit I use them both. I don't want to say interchangeably, but I do use them both. And I tend to follow the lead of what the person I'm talking to self-identifies as. If the person I'm talking to says, I'm a victim of sexual abuse, I may start out using that term as well, but I do like to reframe it towards as we progress through our conversation as, yes, you were victimized, but you are obviously also a survivor, right? And so I think that's part of what, we do in therapy, and that's part of what, that counseling aspect is, understanding that you're not what you've been through, right? So yes, you may see yourself as a victim. You certainly were victimized, but how can we move you now towards thinking of yourself as a survivor, and, use some of, how can you become resilient and use what you've been through to come out stronger on the other end?
Yeah, I think that's really important. Any thoughts from you, Rukhsana? Or yeah, I saw you
Yeah,
nodding
no, I
your head.
think Shannon explained it perfectly. I think really sort of taking that step back and sort of listening to the patient and hearing how they sort of construct that in their minds or their sort of self-image, and then trying to help them find their power. And I think that kind of hooks back up to self-care as well, trying to find ways to feel like you can empower yourselves, because I think what can happen is when you experience that trauma, that power was taken away from you. And so when you are experiencing things in your life where you feel like your power is being taken away from you, you can sort of have some of those symptoms again. And so trying to kind of bring that power back in your hands, because that sort of re-experiencing is so difficult. And so I think, trying to find active ways of doing that. And so, when we think of that sort of politically, talking about like voting, and really, sometimes a lot of my patients will come in and talk politics because it is so troubling to them. And so I really kind of encourage them to sort of see what can they do in their own neighborhoods, to try to make some kind of impact, to do something, whether it's, calling your representatives or writing postcards, voting, all of those things are small ways of being able to feel as though you have some say-so, some power. And it's interesting to sort of, when I think back about people that I've talked with, people that didn't vote had many times in their life where they felt very powerless, sort of in general in their lives. And oftentimes they didn't vote because, again, they didn't think that they would have any impact. So I think it connects that way too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's actually a really interesting point, because there are all these statistics, and I don't have them off the top of my head, around the number of people who didn't vote who are now feeling very regretful, and how many this past week have just kind of come back and kind of realized the importance of that was a way to take back power, and still is a way, obviously, to take back power. Okay, so I'm going to ask a question now that came from this group. And how do we deal with the quote unquote imposter syndrome? So this idea where we tell ourselves that we're not good enough to do something. So if we've dealt with trauma, PTSD, and anxiety, but when it comes to like work, relationships, community, for instance, like you might have had something really bad happen to you at some point, but when you're trying to, do something in the community, or you're trying to do well at work, but you need to take these days off because you're feeling triggered, or you're feeling sluggish or foggy because of the PTSD that you have had, and the real anxiety that's coming back up. But it sort of makes you then feel like you're not good enough to do any of this stuff, meaning I have to take off work. I can't seem to focus. So obviously, look at me, I'm not good enough to do the work, to do all this stuff. So it sort of feels like it's this cycle, kind of like this vicious cycle, that like you're trying to take time to care, but then you feel like you can't do anything because you have to take off. Does that make sense? And hopefully I'm articulating that question correctly too.
It makes sense. And so in my case, for the publicity for this event, I was billed as a mental health expert, right? And I don't feel like I'm an expert in any way. And so that's a part of what the anxiety, right? And it's like, no, I'm not an expert, right?
In fact, I talked with someone yesterday and I was like, you should be doing this talk. Why am I doing that?
Right? And so that's imposter syndrome, because no, I am qualified to come on and talk about anxiety and coping skills and all of that. And so I think a part of what we do is we engage in this negative self-talk when it's not valid. Like, and we have to just go for it. Like, I'm here, I'm talking, I have my notes, I'm prepared. I know what I'm talking about. I have the education, I have the experience, and just go for it. Right. And we have to really dispute those negative self-talks that we impose on ourselves. And, you know, with the sick days and taking time off, you know, a colleague explained this to me, or, you know, reframed this for me. Like, those are your sick days. You earned them, right? Like, every pay period, you know, you earn those. So you shouldn't feel bad about taking them. I mean, obviously you want to be responsible, you know, how you're taking your time off. But, you know, if you stop working there, you don't get those sick days back. You don't get reimbursed. So it's not, there should not be shame associated with that. Like, you should take care of your wellness, and that's a part of it.
Yeah. One thing I'll just say, and then I'll let Rukhsana speak to that, because in my professional space, I run a health and wellness program for like 25,000 people. And I can tell you that there's this growing trend nationally with companies to recognize and acknowledge mental health, because it costs money, to be frank. And because we don't pay attention to it, and because companies weren't always, there was always a stigma in many workplaces, and still is, this concept of saying that you can take a mental health day. So there's a lot of movements even in the kind of employer company world to try to push more wellness programs that are focusing on mental health, because it really does affect the workplace, right? If your employees aren't sound and whole, they can't come to work sound and whole either. And so it's definitely something that more and more people are taking note of. I also want to mention, because somebody asked this question too about like workplace, and I want to, a lot of companies, even small companies, you'd be surprised, have these employee assistance programs. They're called like EAP programs. Most people, they're probably the most under-marketed programs at any company, but they have a lot of things that are actually free to employees. So employers pay for them, and they're free completely to the employees to take advantage of them. So we'll obviously talk at the end about multiple resources and stuff like that. But I do, since we're talking a little bit about workplace, want to make sure that people understand that there's a lot of programs. Make sure you seek out whatever wellness programs your company offers, or even if you're insured, a lot of insurance carriers have wellness programs. Actually, you just have to call and like find out what some of those things are. Rukhsana, did you want to talk about that too? Or not this?
Yeah,
but...
I was just going to say that I think probably so many women, all women maybe, experience some degree of imposter syndrome because, you know, you sort of, like when you see people giving talks or on a stage or, you know, presentations at, you know, professional organizations and that kind of thing, you know, they seem so polished and put together, and you don't see sort of everything else in their lives, of course. And so then it's easy to kind of like extrapolate that to the rest of their lives and sort of compare it to yours and not have a very accurate depiction of, you know, that they're just another woman just like you are. So, so, you know, you sort of take that where most of the population probably feels that way, but then you've got someone who has any kind of psychiatric illness, PTSD, depression, anxiety, and it can make it that much worse. So, and I think the other thing to remember too, sort of to build on top of the wellness programs, is that a lot of times workplaces will have some kind of FMLA too that you can take. So let's say, you know, you're really struggling and you can't function at work. You know, don't be afraid to find out, can you take FMLA where you can take a month off, 2 months off, 3 months off, and use that time to be seeing your psychiatrist, seeing a therapist, getting into some kind of like a day program at a hospital. You know, utilize that time to really aggressively work on yourself, and hopefully you can cover a lot of ground in a short period of time. But, you know, I mean, I fill out those forms all the time for people, and it can be really helpful. It's a hard decision sometimes to make because people do feel guilty, you know, they worry about their job. But I mean, I've had people take several months, and it can oftentimes be life-saving for them.
Yeah, and just to make sure everyone understands, FMLA is something, it's called Family Medical Leave Act. So if you qualify and you take that time off, I think it's like 12 weeks, you have to get your job back. So doesn't necessarily mean the company will pay you during that time. So that depends on company policy. but it's required for you to be able to get your job back. So, you know, years and years ago, there was a lot more fear of people, you know, trying to take leaves, and then obviously not getting their job. That's why the act was put into place, so people could take that time. Most often people are taking it for like things like, you know, maternity leave or so, but that's a really good point, because I don't think that people necessarily understand and realize the outs that they have potentially with the work, the employer that they have, to be able to take advantage of it. You know, I started doing a thing with my own team, because some of this is we have to talk more about mental health. We have to talk more about the anxiety. You know, I think even talking with your coworkers more around mental health, like, hey, I'm just going to take a mental health day. If any of you guys are leaders of teams, like, be that leader who talks about mental health, and show them that you're going to take a mental health day, because this is how we sort of combat that stigma that's out there. And we lead by example to say, yep, today's just going to be a mental health day. And you know what? I'm a good professional. I'm going to make sure all the work gets done, but I'm going to take this day to myself. I think that's really important as well. Okay. So another question that came, and is, you know, actually, I'm gonna switch to another question, because it's kind of in line with workplace. So the question is, how do you document and report sexual innuendo environment in the workplace? HR is not necessarily the answer for fear of repercussions. Where do you report outside of the workplace? So I can start just to talk a little bit, since I am in the HR space. So regardless of what company you're at, and whether or not they're good HR or bad HR, so if you don't feel like HR is the right space because of repercussions, then I will tell you they're bad HR, because that's primarily what they're supposed to do. But you do have a legal team. Every company has a lawyer, at least one. And if you don't have a proper, like, many companies call them like hotline complaints, so they're meant to like take in complaints from employees. If you're too small of a company, you don't have something like that, almost everybody has at least a lawyer that plays that role. I reach out to the legal team, and make sure that you're getting heard, and that you're documenting the concerns that you have, because someone at the company needs to know and needs to acknowledge it. There's also ways with governmental places like the Department of Labor that you can actually file complaints against your employer if you really don't feel like you're being heard. But I would definitely start with at least working within, you know, your company, and going to multiple resources. Obviously, things like sexual innuendo, I mean, that's really big for companies, big or small. And I recognize in smaller companies, sometimes that stuff can go left unsaid. It depends on your leader. They might allow that kind of behavior, which is not okay. But certainly in any medium-sized company or large company, this concept of workplace harassment, it's not just sexual harassment, but workplace harassment, is a really important topic that there's large movements to make sure that that is getting quelched. I remember when I'm going to share a little bit. I remember when I first started working many years ago, almost 20 years ago, it was a lot more common, and it would be very subtle. It'd be jokes. It'd be subtle comments maybe about the way you look and things like that. And now there's a lot that has obviously gone on to help make that not as common, but definitely there are avenues at your workplace. And I'm happy to talk to anyone, you know, offline, you know, to just kind of work through your situation. But Shannon and Rukhsana, do you guys have any thoughts on that?
I don't. I'm not familiar with who to report it to outside of HR. My instinct would be to make sure you're documenting things that happen, you know, for your personal records, maybe, you know, jotting down dates, times, taking photos, you know, maybe recording things, so that if HR is not in fact who you feel comfortable with reporting to, whoever, you know, the legal team or whoever else you do decide to report to later on, you have as much documentation as possible.
Okay, great. Okay, so this is, I think this question is good for whether they're organizations like ours or just even individuals. in your guys' opinion, do we have to put out trigger warning as a disclaimer before every social media post regarding this topic? Some people do it, some people don't. What are your thoughts?
So, Saror, you mentioned the EAP programs that most employers, pay for their employees to go and receive mental health or behavioral health services. And I'll disclose for myself, about 2 years ago, 2016, 2015, something like that, when the election season was there, and there were all these political rallies and all of this, and there was the political climate, there was all of these Black men and Black women getting shot down, Black boys getting shot down by police. I mean, and I was just eating this all up on social media. And I had to go through my EAP to see a therapist myself. As a therapist, I had to go and see a therapist because I could not sleep. I was anxious. It was disrupting my life, right? And one of the things that the therapist helped me realize was, okay, this low media diet, low social media diet. So I was watching, these men getting shot down by the police, on repeat. Okay. And so she said, well, you have to stop. I mean, if this is causing you anxiety, why keep doing it? Right. And so I think it is important. Since then, whenever that was, maybe 2015, 2016, I have not watched another video. Right. And so I appreciate those trigger warnings, saying, hey, if you scroll down, this is what you're going to see, or this is what you're going to read. Because you never know, you never know what's going to pop up on the screen, and you never know how that might affect someone. So I appreciate the trigger warnings.
Any additional comments, Rukhsana, if you want?
Yeah. No, I would agree. I think it's helpful, because like you said, if you're trying to sort of walk that line of trying to be more balanced with how much social media you're consuming, you want to try to be on there if it's sort of meeting other needs, obviously, and to try to be able to do that without running across things that are going to be triggering for you would be helpful. It's because it's so hard to predict. You don't know how many people will react, and I know sometimes people think it's gone almost too far the other way, where now there's trigger warnings for everything. But honestly, I think it's helpful. It might not matter to you. You may have no problem at all watching or reading whatever, but someone out there might. So I think it's helpful to just kind of be mindful of that.
Okay, great. Thanks. So I think we'll probably have time for 2 more questions. So I'm going to ask one more from the ones that were submitted, and then there's one that's already in queue in the chat. And certainly for anyone on their phone, again, if any of you guys want to unmute your phone and ask a question, please definitely feel free to do that. But again, you can put anything in the group chat. You can send it to me just privately or to everyone, and I'll make sure to get that question answered as well. This one, and I'm sort of interpreting what this question might be referring to. So since I don't know if the person is on the phone who asked this question, but the question is, why are so many women having such a visceral reaction to Dr. Ford's testimony versus Anita Hill's? I'm not sure if, again, I don't know who the person who wrote this, but, there might be a race thing in here. So let's talk a little bit about that, because I know there's statistics about Black women versus other women, and when it comes to sexual violence and stuff. Who wants to go first to talk about that?
I can. So, when we talk about taking back control, right, about the situation, I think that's one of the points I was going to make, is that there's really an opportunity here for us to do some intersectional work, right? So we have what's going on, violence against women, discrimination against women. But there's also most definitely a racial factor in this, right? Because the Anita Hill situation took place in 1991, like the same exact thing, like during these confirmation hearings. And there was backlash, against Dr. Hill, and she received nowhere near the acclaim and the fanfare that Dr. Ford is receiving. We can speculate on, many, there can be, and there probably are different reasons for that. But I even look to, what happened with Bill Cosby. I mean, there are dozens of men in Hollywood who are accused of sexual assault, all kinds of things, who charges have not even been brought against them. Right. And so you see then there's this reaction to Bill Cosby. That's an interesting reaction because he admitted, to doing some really creepy, illegal things. And so, he should serve prison time for that. But I think what people are reacting to is that, that racial disparity and that injustice, right? Like, well, why do some people get this reaction? Why do some people get this reaction? Why do some people get this consequence and some people don't? And so I think when we're having these discussions, it's very important to be intersectional about our work. If you're going to get involved, make sure when you're addressing women's rights, you're also addressing Black women's rights. Like, make sure when you're addressing, criminal justice issues, you're also addressing the racial issues that fall within that. Just my opinion.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important because, and I liked what you said about when you're discussing women's rights, talk about Black men's rights, because the reality is what we're talking about is rights being taken away, regardless of what identity you have. And so how do we acknowledge and recognize that that's where what we're basically trying to do is come together as a society and say everyone has rights. Like, we should all be able to have rights to safety. And safety is the common right that we're asking everyone to have, is to be able to be safe, to be able to not have unwanted advances, not be thrown down, not have any sort of assaults happen, regardless of what it is, right? And so I think that's really important. I also think it's important to recognize over the last couple of years, I started off in the intro talking about this, where it's one thing after another after another. Social media allows us to see a lot more things than we saw 20 years ago, right? So there's things that, like, there's, in a good and a bad way, people can get propelled really quickly into spaces where somebody would have never heard about before. But what that also means is that we are seeing so much. So when you see all the stuff that are happening to Black men, Black boys, and really we should refer to it as boys because they're really young. But we also then see all the stuff that's going on with women and Black women or any kind of women. It's all connected to the anxiety, and it's all connected to why everyone is feeling the sense of like there's just so much going on, right? And so I think that's really important too. Rukhsana, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you both. I think for women that are, in their 30s, they may have been too young to really know what was going on with Anita Hill back in 91. I know I was. And so I think, this is our sort of first time maybe seeing something like this where you've got, a professional woman who has gone through this. And, and it's interesting sort of talking with a few of my physician friends, and on social media and in physician groups, so many women, at least in the medical field, have gone through sexual harassment or sexual assault. And so it's, I think there's just that immediate identification with her. And then social media just amplifies it so much more.
Yeah, I think that is a good point. And I think this kind of goes into the question that was posed in the group too, is around kind of, we often, and we started talking about this earlier around categorizing whether something's big or small, right? And I think that sometimes when you are viewing so much, your thing that happened to you might feel really small because you're looking at what happened to, Dr. Ford, or you're looking at what happened to Anita Hill, or looking at what happened to all the people who came out through when the Me Too campaign first started years ago, and then again kind of got really kickstarted again earlier this year. It's really easy to kind of get connected to that, but also get really kind of bogged down with it as well. So the last question that we have, and again, if anybody else has another question, we can certainly ask it, but this appears to be the last one. What are the most important things to remember when talking to someone who feels really triggered or have experienced the hashtag Me Too? Does saying things like, it's not your fault, help?
Well, I think off the top, it's important to realize, sexual assault or anything like that is never your fault, right? It's there should never be any fault taken for that. What I try to do is focus on like assertiveness training, because I guess like a lot of times what happens is like people tend to fall into categories. They're either like overly passive or they're like overly aggressive. And so when we're dealing with, relationships or just like interpersonal, communication and things like that, your rights can be taken away if you do not know how to assert them, without being too passive or being too aggressive. And so, I mean, even culturally, right? In some cultures, like a woman is not expected to say certain things or do certain things because it's just not seen as feminine. It's not seen as polite, right? And so part of what I do is to talk with the women and just practice assertiveness training, like things as simple as saying no. Like we literally do role plays, can I borrow money? No. And I mean, it seems silly, but women, myself included, I do not know how to say no a lot of times. And so, and you see that's a small example, but it can definitely snowball into, this issue around consent that we're dealing with now. And so I don't think we want to use like these like kind of empty platitudes when we're talking to women. We don't want to just, throw out these sayings. But we do want to emphasize, the power that women have, again, take back that power. Let's not leave women and girls like vulnerable to predators and, all of these things. So when we say things like that, I think maybe we're like grasping for something to say. We don't know what exactly to say. And so we're just trying to fill the space. So it's not necessarily, in my opinion, it's not necessarily wrong. But there are more effective ways to kind of address, or have that conversation.
Rukhsana, your thoughts?
Yeah. And so actually I was going to, there was a question that came up in the chat, sort of privately, but I can kind of generalize it to, I think, because it connects sort of to what you're saying, Shannon. So this person was asking about how do you protect your kids? And sort of, I guess really the answer is how do you help them to be assertive in situations? And this person was talking specifically about her kids and not being allowed to go for sleepovers or sort of hanging out with cousins in groups alone for extended period of times, and getting very worried and anxious about that, and then sort of also maybe getting flack from in-laws about not letting your kids hang out. And so I guess how do you sort of then like help your kids to either be assertive in those situations? And I know that's kind of been a question in my mind, just sort of hearing all of this, and imagining Dr. Ford as a 15-year-old, like how do I make sure when my kid is 15 that they know what to do, And so I think that assertiveness training is great. I mean, maybe even like role playing with your daughter and sort of saying like, if this is happening, what can you say? What can you do? Maybe Shannon can speak to that a little bit more too.
Yeah. And for both boys and girls, right? Like I have a 3.5-year-old son, and my husband and I like role play with him, like, what do you do if someone tries to touch your, and he screams, no, don't touch me. I mean, right. Like you have to start it at young ages with both boys and girls. And I think also because I tend to work primarily with male clients, the conversation is not only me working with women as, victims / survivors, it's also my working with men and letting them know about consent and letting them know I don't care what you and your baby mama got in an argument about, there's no excuse for you to hit her, and because it goes both ways. We can't only focus on assertiveness training for our girls and women. We also have to focus on like raising respectable, young boys and men.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think a couple of things I heard both of you talk about, and I think it's really important to emphasize this. And I will say this as someone who's gone through certain things, and when people tried to offer their support, sometimes well-intended people, we might have really good intentions, but we might do more harm than we mean to do. And I think, Shannon, one of the things you mentioned was, people needing to fill the space. Don't fill the space. People don't always need for you to say something. They just need you to be. And I think as like humans, we're so kind of trained to try to move people past, like run you past that emotion you're feeling. We almost don't know how to sit in the emotions with you. And I would tell everyone to sit in it with people. I think the most powerful thing and the most bonding thing that you could do, and the most way you can help your friend, is to be there with them. Like, you don't have to say anything. If you're just sitting there, you just go for a hug, or you go for dinner, or you just take them out, go for a walk. But just knowing that someone is there, I think is really uplifting and powerful for a person. But I think also as a community, we need to learn to be in the kind of dark moments with people, which means just sitting there. And I think another really important thing, because I know this happens a lot, is people using scripture or faith. So for example, in Islam, whether it's the hadiths of the prophet or the teachings of the prophet, or the or Quranic quotes and scriptures, to kind of tell people things like, well, don't worry, God wouldn't give you anything that you can't handle. Well, we know that's to be true, but in the moment when someone's going through something, that's actually not very helpful for them to know that they're being tested because they're really strong. Like, no one really honestly wants to hear that if you're actually going through something. But it's well-intended, and of course it has good meaning. And so there's this concept of spiritual bypassing that I came across a few years ago, that I found really powerful in making sure that if we're the people who are trying to provide the support to someone, whether it's as a community, as friends, relationships, make sure you're not utilizing spiritual bypassing methods where you're using whatever faith you're in to push people past the emotion that they're feeling. Like, it's okay for them to feel a little, uncomfortable, despair, sad, angry, whatever those emotions are. And there's a time and a place for that. And just to be cautious of that as well, to not quickly move people past things. I don't know if either one of you guys have any wrap up comments on that, and then we can wrap it up.
I like that concept of spiritual bypassing, right? And I would say, if someone feels the need to fill a space with, one of these like hadith or, spiritual sayings, maybe try to use the hadith that says, if you see an evil, try to change it with your, hand, try to change it with your tongue, then, the weakest of the options is to try to change it with your heart. And then that's completely paraphrased, right? But if you want to use, kind of coming from an Islamic perspective, you utilize that. Some of the things that you can do to try to change things with your hands, like we've already talked about it, go out and vote, like lobby these politicians and elected officials in your community, participate in rallies and protests, even, if you don't believe that it's going to change anything, but just if nothing more for the camaraderie and like building community and getting to know other people who share the same passions. You can volunteer for a cause that you're passionate about. Changing it with your tongue, like literally speaking out against things. I try to tell people, like, being apolitical is not helpful, right? Like, I know people like to avoid controversy and they don't want to step on toes, but sometimes silence can be betrayal. And we see that with current events when people for so long, want to defend or withhold information that can potentially incriminate people, right? Like it leaves these cases going on for years. Stopping inappropriate jokes, whether they're racial jokes, gender jokes, things like that. That's an example of changing something with your tongue. And, if you can't do any of that, at the very least, pray for victims, pray for survivors, pray that those who do these horrible things will be brought to justice. Because unlike with spiritual bypassing, this is something that I told myself, when things were really like at the height of, Black Lives Matter and all of these police shootings, when these really came to light a few years ago. And police officer after police officer after police officer are not even so much as getting charges brought against them. I had to tell myself, if I truly believe, I believe that, okay, sure, you keep your job, nothing's going to happen to you now, but on the day of judgment, you'll get what's coming to you. And so that's how I personally reconcile with whatever I perceive to be injustice going on in this life. I know that it'll be taken care of, inshallah. So there are ways to incorporate spirituality into coping, and those are some of the, ways that I would suggest.
Absolutely. Great thoughts. Rukhsana, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think just sort of jumping off of that, I think at the end of the day, trying to find ways of sort of reclaiming your power. And so it doesn't have to be a huge, big thing, but it can be a lot of the small things that Shannon talked about. And hopefully that helps people to sort of like take those small steps, and then maybe it can kind of become something larger that you can be a part of. And I think for a lot of people, their faith can be something that is helpful to them. And so, if it is, then use that, use whatever is helpful for you. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the concept of spiritual bypassing doesn't mean you don't use your faith. Just to clarify it in case anybody else didn't understand that or took that away. It's not meant that you don't take your faith. I mean, people have different various levels of faith, and what grounds you, like for me personally, what grounds me is my faith. So of course it has to be a part of how I would cope through anything as well. But it's more as that way of when you're trying to be supportive to someone else, not to let that sort of be a inhibitor. So I want to thank everyone.
Right.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Sana.
I was just going to say, I think that it's helpful to just sort of validate. I think what we're saying is being able to validate that person in that time and space. And it's very hard to do. It can be very uncomfortable. I mean, even as a trained professional, when someone is really hurting, it can be hard, but you're there with them, and that means the world.
Yeah, no, I think sometimes we tend to over-engineer things, and sometimes it's just as simple as like sitting next to people and my heart getting connected to your heart, and that's all that really I need, or any of us really need at the end of the day. So I want to thank everyone who came onto this call. We are at our time. I want to thank both Shannon and Rukhsana for taking time out so quickly and time away from their families. We put this together as a response to what we heard in the community, what we heard from many of you, heard from many other people who aren't on this phone. And we wanted to be able to create this space. And we're so appreciative here at Muslim Women's Alliance for Shannon and Rukhsana, because they mobilized, they got babysitters, they figured out ways to adjust their schedule. So thank you very much from the bottom of our hearts. And I just want to end with reminding everyone, at the end of the day, the compassion we share to others, make sure to share it to yourself. And if any of you do feel like you need more assistance or would like more resources, obviously we've got Rukhsana and Shannon that you can contact. And then we have a whole list of other mental health professionals also that we can provide to you. So feel free to message us and we can connect you with various resources that are out there as well. So with that, we will close our session and hope everyone enjoys their weekend and continues on this healing journey. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Thank you.